Thanks for joining us for 11 Investigates Case Files. I'm Melissa Andrews along with Brian Duggar. We're taking a deeper look today into the murders of two Toledo teens, Kamarian Wilder and KyShawn Pittman in 2022. We'll talk more in depth about the case, the suspects, and see some previously unseen clips. Brian, I always think people are interested in why we decide 11 Investigates to highlight a particular case.
Yeah, this was just an extraordinary case. When you think about it, 11 people ended up getting convicted. Two teenagers obviously killed and left in a home which was then firebombed. You just don't see something like this. And everybody we talked to for this case, they had never really seen anything like this when you have 11 different suspects and ultimately people convicted.
So the way that we get into this case first is talking about the family, because here is a family, as is most missing persons case. There's a family who wants to know where these two kids, two families, and a lot of friends. And you actually interviewed the family of Kamarian Wilder for this piece.
Yeah, I did. And we really, obviously, we don't, we have the court records, police records, that's all interesting, but we really want to be able to show the impact to the families, the devastation that this causes. So that was very important to try to track down the families. And we were able to find Kamarian's family. And I talked to the grandmother, a couple of his sisters, his dad. His dad didn't want to go on camera, but I talked to them.
And really, this story starts with the interaction with Kamarian Wilder's family and some of the suspects who lived at the house where the boys were last known to be. Here you are talking to Malia, his sister.
I got a call from a family member saying he was at a party and that he got kicked out of a party and he had to find a ride home. It was after he stopped being reachable. Nobody could reach him. That's not like my brother. My brother will never go a day without contacting not a soul. Like, we talk to him day in, day out.
Yeah, so put this even a little bit more in context. So the boys had been invited to a birthday party at Maumee Bay State Park, which is one of the resorts just outside of Toledo that day. And, witnesses later said that one of the boys, I'm not exactly sure which one, ended up showing off a gun that he had. And the mother of the girl whose birthday it was said, "You gotta go." So at this point, these guys are kind of stranded because they'd been out here. They're trying to reach out to family members, to get a ride. One of the family members was in Columbus and they couldn't reach other family members. So at this point, they're really kind of stuck and they can't figure out how to get out of here until they reach out to a young friend who's the nephew of a man by the name of Corbin Gingrich, who lived on Maumee Avenue in Toledo.
So Corbin Gingrich wanted to talk to those boys because there had been several thefts that had been happening, things like marijuana, a gun, there had been an attempted robbery, and a bunch of these people who come into play here, some of these 11 suspects thought that these boys had stolen from them.
Yeah, and we're still, even at this point, and we've examined thousands of pages of documents, we're still not completely sure whether they did or not.
Neither are the prosecutors even, or the police.
Yeah, and the family, I talked to the family, they're like, my brother had nothing to do with this.
So we set up the family. They are looking for these boys. They learned through social media posts and contacting Kamarian that the boys were in this house on Maumee Avenue. And so we have a really interesting interaction with Kamarian's family and some of the suspects. You're going to hear his sister again sum up what really got the police interested.
Corbin Gingrich sent Clarissa Eames to the door, and she answered the door and said that she haven't spoke to my brother and he hasn't been there.
Did they even deny that he was there the previous day, even though he had all the...
They did. They denied he was there, period. They said he never came.
Obviously, you guys knew that was a lie.
Yeah, we did the whole time.
So when you guys left there, and I know you said you were sitting in the car, but how were you feeling? What were you feeling?
I was crying. I was sitting in the car and I was screaming to my dad, telling them that I knew they were lying, to not believe them, to go in their house and look for himself. But at the time, we was scared that if we retaliated something, if my brother wasn't already passed away, something bad would have happened to him. So we was just trying to stay as positive as we was, but I knew the whole time that my brother was there.
So again, I mean, we know through social media posts that Corbin Gingrich got his younger nephew to kind of lure these kids to the house because he believed they stole the gun and he wanted to confront them. So we know they were at Maumee Avenue by all these social media posts, and then suddenly there's no more contact. And when the families, and they weren't the only ones that went to this house, but when the families go to the house, you know, the residents say, nope, they were never here.
I feel for her when she says she started crying and she said, no, they're lying, they're lying. You can really identify with how you would feel in a moment like that. You would be so angry because you have in your mind this proof, these messages that your brother was in this house. This was the last place he was been, and everyone's saying, oh, I've never seen him.
Yeah, and like she said there, I mean, she wanted her dad to go in the house and look around, but she couldn't do that because she kind of knew of these people, and they weren't the best people in the world. Mm-hmm. And if she believed that they had taken, you know, her brother, I mean, she just wasn't sure what was going to happen if they forced the issue. Mm-hmm. But they knew they were in that house.
Yeah, over the course of the next 15 days or so, 10, 15 days, the boys were missing. It turned into a murder investigation, as you saw in the piece. And at one point, a canine handler was called in. There is only one cadaver group here in the Northwest Ohio area, and it's actually run out of the Springfield Township Police Department. Shelby Flagel is the woman who, along with her dog Darwin, actually found the boys in that house on Chase.
We'd like you to come out and tell us, you know, what Darwin thinks of a house that we recently bulldozed, because they had bulldozed the entire house into the foundation. I try to, when we go on calls, get as little information as possible.
I was just going to ask you, do they tell you they think they're bodies, or do they just want your complete?
Yeah. So sometimes they will, but we always, like, if I know, a lot of people here are starting to know me. I think the less information that we know, the better, because you don't want to convince the dog. Like if somebody tells me somebody's in there, I'm gonna think somebody's in there. So I'm gonna push Darwin a little bit harder into things where he could be like, well, I don't smell anything, but Mom really thinks there's something here. You know, it's a partnership. So a lot of the times the dog really vibes off of what you are, like the signals that you're sending off. So that's why I like to go in there as blind as possible. And even, so I think, I can't remember, I think I maybe searched first, but the second canine handler that was running didn't watch us run. You know, she went in there blind as well. That way she wasn't like pushing her dog into a certain area, you know, or whatnot, so we could get the most accurate spot.
It was really interesting to talk to Shelby. We didn't include much of our conversation in the pieces, but she gave us a demonstration there in the firehouse about how the dog detects the human remains and just sits down, very clearly alerting that they found something.
Yeah, and she said in this case, there was no doubt about it. The dog sat down and he had definitely found
Yeah,
something.
and what she was describing is that she wants as little information as possible from the police agency that's requesting her to go search, because she doesn't want, if she knows that there are bodies and this is where they are, she doesn't want the dog to be led there by her. She wants the dog to truly smell that odor and then alert there for sure.
But the big question, Mel, is how did they even know to look in this house? Because this is nowhere near Maumee Avenue. It's several miles away.
Well, actually, it was a Crime Stoppers tip. And really, until we worked on this story, I've read on the news 1,000 times that Crime Stoppers can remain anonymous. But I always thought that the person who calls in and gives that tip must come forward and identify themselves in some way to be able to use the evidence in court that they're bringing forth. But in fact, we found out that a Crime Stopper tip came in saying you need to check this house on Chase Street that burned down for those boys. And then in another roundabout fashion, the mother of KyShawn Pittman also came forward and said to the police, you need to check that house. But that person was never truly identified. Even the prosecutor doesn't know who that person is.
Yeah, I was going to say, to this day, I mean, lots of us want to know who that person was because they clearly had information that was correct, and they knew the kids were dead at that point, and nobody else really knew they were dead.
Yeah, but even before we get to that point, Brian, at this point in the investigation, the sergeant that we talked to said that all these people were lying, all of these 11 people. And I asked him, how do you know? How do you get to the bottom of who's lying and who is telling the truth?
Well, when family went there to kind of talk to them about it, they pretended they hadn't seen them, even though we had posts confirming from that address, confirming that they were in fact there. So that was one of the big red flags right away. And then we brought them in here, and they told us some stories that didn't quite resonate truthfully, but we didn't have anything at the moment to kind of go further. It wasn't until over the weekend and then coming on Monday that we started to realize that they were completely lying.
So what kind of tactics did you use to try to get the truth out of them?
Well, so I tend to find that when people try to lie, like if they work out a story, they think they work out all the details, but if you get multiple people in a building at the same time and they don't know what the other person's saying, not only do they get nervous about what that other person's saying, but it's hard to keep the details correct. So you try to get them to tell the story, and again, if they want to be honest, then sometimes that'll resonate. But when you start having really wide inconsistencies from one person's story to another, then at least one, if not both of them, are lying.
Yeah, so what he's talking about there, initially there were several people in the house that they knew were in the house, and they were denying to family members that they had seen Kamarian or KyShawn, and they knew that just wasn't right. So beginning a couple days after the disappearance, they started bringing these people in, and they were telling much different stories. And then, well, as you know, after they find the bodies, the cadaver dog find the bodies, at that point, it's no longer a missing person case, it's a murder case of 2 teenagers. And all these people they had been talking about previously, they knew they were involved in this case in somehow, some way. Maybe they didn't know if they had killed them or whether they had helped kill them, helped them get rid of the bodies, or what was going on. And so it was up to Sergeant Kennedy at this point to try to figure out who was telling the truth and who wasn't. And it was also up to the prosecutor. Maggie Cuck was the assistant prosecuting attorney on this case at trial. She was the lead prosecutor. So she kind of had to wade through all these interviews, right?
Well, initially, most of these people, if not all, were charged with murder. And so a common strategy that prosecutors and police will use is to heavily charge at first and then make deals to try to get them to speak the truth and figure out who exactly did what action, who lured the boys, who kidnapped the boys, and who ultimately were the actual people who killed the boys. So we talked with the lead prosecutor about some of the deals they offered and why she had to make those deals. It's not something they really like to do. So listen here to how they try to find out who did what in the case.
That can be a difficult process. You're trying to look at, one, who's being the most honest with you, because it is very common, especially in proffers and when somebody's charged with a crime, that you try to mitigate your involvement in various ways. I've done a lot of proffers, and it usually takes a couple goes where you say, we just want the truth, you're not being honest with us, and here's why we know you're not being honest. So you're kind of trying to confront them with that, and eventually you get to a point where what they're saying is consistent with the evidence.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I forgot exactly what the point I wanted to make. Oh, this was the point I wanted to make. So as they're interviewing these guys, the guys who are represented by different attorneys, those attorneys are getting some of the discovery and they're hearing what some of the other suspects are saying. So when we talk about the story changing over and over and over, these people, when they're being called before the police and being interviewed, at that point, they kind of know what their buddies are saying. And what we saw over time with this case is some of these stories just began to change.
Well, it makes sense because you want to get a good deal for yourself if you're one of these defendants. Now is where we want to go back to talking about the Crime Stoppers tip that came in, because this is really going to play in a lot with the defense. The detective talked about why he went to that house and he got that information, but when you can't question a tipster, it kind of brings up what's called a hearsay rule, right?
Yeah, and what's interesting about that, right, under the Constitution, you have a right to confront your accuser. And so one of the informants, well, two people actually told the police they believe the boys were in the house, but one of them mentioned a name that we'll introduce you to later, and they said, well, you might want to check into this guy. He was involved. Well, that raises a whole host of problems because now you have someone accusing someone of, we don't know who this person is, so essentially his constitutional rights are he should be able to confront them, and he's not able to do that.
Okay, listen to me asking the lead prosecutor, Maggie Cuck, about this Crime Stoppers tip and how it also really came to be a big piece of this case. You said something that was interesting, and we've always reported, call Crime Stoppers, you can remain anonymous. I always, though, assumed that somehow their testimony has to make it into a trial. That's not the case?
That is not the case.
Oh.
If they wish to remain anonymous, when I get a copy of the Crime Stopper tip, it says anonymous. I don't necessarily have a phone number. I don't have any of that information. That information can't be used necessarily at trial because
of the hearsay?
It's hearsay. Now, there are some exceptions.
Now, when we were going through the thousands and thousands of pages of trial transcripts, that is everything that's said during the trial, that Crime Stoppers tip came up in a sidebar conversation, which people in the courtroom, if you watch court TV, you never get to hear what the judge and the attorneys are talking about in those sidebar conversations. And they were talking about, in part, at one point, the Crime Stoppers tip and whether or not it should be, how the detective can be questioned about that tip.
Yeah, and that's interesting because what we heard during the testimony of Paul Marchiak, who is the lead detective in this case, during his testimony, he says, yes, we began receiving information that the boys were in this house. Well, of course, the natural question is, where are you getting this information
Who
from?
told you? How did they know? What did they see? And you are unable to question that person.
Right, and what that person knew, Mel, is that the boys were in this house. They weren't there tied up or whatever. This person apparently knew that the boys were dead in that house, and then the house had been firebombed because somebody wanted to destroy it. So somebody had that information.
And it really makes you wonder if it was somebody in that house who maybe had a weight of conscience, who knew what happened to those boys, who knew they were only boys, or someone closely associated with someone in that house who would have that information, but maybe knew that in coming forward in their individual testimony or at the trial, they would face retribution.
Absolutely. And I think what we saw throughout this case, yes, 11 people were convicted, but there is certainly different layers of bad people in this case. I mean, there were some that probably did have a conscience about what they knew had happened, and others were just evil, evil people.
It was really remarkable. And you really honed in the pieces on talking to the defense because the appeals process is underway for Charles Walker and Brent Kohlhofer. You interviewed both of their attorneys.
Yeah, so...
And their attorney's job is to first try to make sure they don't go to prison and then try to get them out of prison once they're there.
Right, and I'm not even quite sure if we brought up Kohlhofer and Walker at this point, but the narrative that the police eventually get to is that Cruz Garcia, he came over, confronted the boys, beat them, and then he told police that Brent Kohlhofer was also looking for these boys. So what he told police and what the prosecution eventually says at trial is that he walked them out to the alley. Brent, Charles, beat the boys, wrap them with duct tape, take them away. They end up in the house on Chase Street. The house is firebombed. And that ultimately Brent and Charles were the only people in this case charged with aggravated murder. And they're the only ones who went through trial. And at this point, they are sitting in Lebanon Correctional Institution between Cincinnati and Dayton, a life sentence with no chance of parole. And the interesting thing about this, Mel, is that the defense attorneys that I've talked to, and maybe they're just blowing smoke, I don't know, but they said they're convinced these guys had nothing to do with this.
And I asked the prosecution and police both the same thing, and they said that these two are the only ones who truly had the motive. They said, why would Brent Kohlhofer and Charles Walker just show up to this house and dispose of these bodies that someone else had killed there? What would they get out of that?
Well, the defense's argument is that they did not show up to this house. They believe that Cruz Garcia killed these kids in the basement of Maumee Avenue and then tried to cover up and tried to essentially frame Brent, who he was actually selling marijuana for. If you get Brent out of the equation, then Cruz Garcia is the big guy, the big drug dealer in town. So their argument is they never showed up to this house. And there's cell tower records, there's phone records, and they claim it shows that their guys were nowhere near this house.
So you interviewed both of their attorneys. We're going to hear from Michael Stahl right now, who is Charles Walker's attorney.
And this is a really serious issue, not just for the facts of the case. It's a constitutional issue. You have a right under the U.S. Constitution and the Ohio Constitution to confront the witnesses against you. Well, effectively what we have is a police detective who's far more credible than Cruz Garcia or Corbin Gingrich could ever be, especially in the minds of the jury, right? Who's making these assertions, but we don't know where they're actually coming from.
And is that going back to the argument of not being able to confront your accusers?
That absolutely goes back, yeah. Sorry about that. We actually got a little out of the way there, but yeah, he was talking about when Marchak was on the stand and saying that, yeah, we began to get this information. And again, they believe that their guys had nothing to do with this, but they believe that somebody that was that informant for the police might have had something more to do about it, or at least knew the actual story about what happened.
You mentioned that one of the key elements here was the phone records. We have a clip right now between Kohlhofer's attorney, Brandon Henderson, and the state's key witness, Cruz Garcia, explaining a supposed phone call.
When I was cross-examining Cruz, he was talking about how, the first phone call was literally 1 second, and how he had gotten out this extremely important piece of information within that. When I said 1 second, he said, yeah, 1 second. I said, are you sure? He said, yeah. And I mean, there's so much here with the timeline.
Tell us what he means by that.
Yeah, so this is interesting because, again, there were phone records. The prosecution was saying that phone records show that Cruz Garcia called Brent Kohlhofer, or Brent Kohlhofer called Cruz Garcia and said, hey, I'm in the alley. Or maybe I have this backwards. Anyhow, there was a phone call where Cruz is talking to Brent Kohlhofer, and he tells Brent, hey, go around to the alley behind the house because there's no cameras there, so you'll be hidden there, and then I will bring the boys out to you. So you saw Brandon there. He confronts Cruz on the cross-examination and says, so you gave him all of this information in 1 second? Because the phone log shows that indeed Cruz tried to call Brent, but it was only a 1 second call. Typically when you see that it's either it goes straight to voicemail or there's a busy signal. I guess there's no busy signals anymore, but it goes straight to voicemail. And so it was a 1-second call. And so in the cross-examination, he said, you told him all of this on the phone call? He's like, yes. You did that in 1 second? And he said, yes, which is a pretty incredible thing to say.
So what does the defense attorney say happened on those 1-second calls?
Well, I mean, what he believed is, again, Cruz Garcia is the drug guy for Brent Kohlhofer. Brent Kohlhofer, nobody disputes it. He was actually selling marijuana, pounds and pounds
Large
of it.
amounts.
But he was a big guy. Cruz Garcia would sell it for him. Cruz would have Corbin Gingrich sell it for him. So his belief was that Cruz Garcia was trying to get a hold of Brent to say, hey, I need some weed today, something like that. And Brent just didn't have his phone on. And so he never talked to him. There was a text earlier in the day from Cruz to Brent where Brent tells Cruz, I'm just going to send bro. So the defense believes that he's going to say, I'm going to send bro, whoever that might be. I don't know. It could be Charles. It could be somebody else that he works with. I'm going to send bro down to your house or Mommy Avenue, and he'll bring drugs that you need. So, of course, the defense looks at that and says, well, that's evidence that he had no intention of even going down to Mommy Avenue.
Mm-hmm. Did the defense lawyers share their feelings with you? And I don't know if they're being truthful when they tell you, were they surprised that their clients were convicted of this?
Oh, Brandon told me that he was absolutely shocked. He said he'd done this for 25 years. And so he actually represented Brent at trial. Mike Stahl, who we've been talking about, he's the appellate attorney. Mm-hmm. So he did not represent Charles at trial, but he's representing him for his appeal. But Brandon said he was absolutely floored. And he said he'd never been more shocked. And he actually claimed that there were bailiffs and people in the court that came up to him after the trial was over, kind of shaking their head and saying, we can't believe that happened.
Well, 12 people did agree with the prosecution.
100%.
Mm-hmm. And so what's next? We've got these appeals going on. Both of them are in appeals?
Both of them, yeah. So at this point, they filed the appeals, and the prosecution gets a chance to respond to that, and then they have another chance to respond. I mean, what we know about appeals, once you're convicted, it is very difficult to be unconvicted, and it takes a long amount of time.
That's why those conversations are so in-depth at those sidebars that I mentioned during the trial, because the judge doesn't want to do anything that would make for any grounds for an appeal. We'd like to thank you for joining us for 11 Investigates Case Files. We will stay on top of these appeals, let you know if anything develops. You can also watch the full special, Piecing Together the Puzzle, the murders of 2 Toledo teens, right now on WTOL 11+. I'm Melissa Andrews, along with Brian Duggar for 11 Investigates.